Lawmakers cited his ordeal when drafting reforms to prevent prosecutorial misconduct. Documentaries chronicled his resilience, and young activists carried signs bearing his name during marches against discrimination. His face, once buried in mugshots, now stood tall on murals painted across city walls, a symbol of endurance and truth. And yet, despite all of it, Marcus never sought fame. He spent his days with Alicia, visiting schools and community centers, speaking softly but powerfully to the next generation. "You don't have to wear a uniform to fight for justice," he told them. "You just have to tell the truth, even when it costs you, especially when it costs you." On a quiet evening, years later, Marcus sat on his porch, the Medal of Honor resting in a box beside him, not on his chest. He gazed at the sunset, the horizon painted in fire and gold. Alicia brought him a cup of tea, and they sat together in silence. For once, the world was not demanding his voice, not pulling at his name. For once, he was simply Marcus Gray, a soldier, a father, a man who had faced the weight of injustice and still stood tall. And as the last light of day dipped below the horizon, he whispered again to the night sky, to the brothers he lost and the battles he survived, "We made it. After all, we made it home." The night in Indianapolis was heavy with silence, broken only by the faint hum of streetlights and the occasional passing car. Alicia Gray sat on the edge of her bed, clutching her phone so tightly her knuckles turned pale. For 18 long months, she had fought to prove her father's innocence, and for 18 long months, every door had slammed in her face. But tonight was different. On the other end of the line was General Richard Hale, a man whose words carried the weight of both history and power. "I have the documents." Hale's voice rumbled with quiet authority. "Declassified last year. Military records that prove your father is not just innocent, Alicia. They prove he's one of the greatest heroes of the Vietnam War. This conviction is an insult, not only to him, but to every soldier who ever risked his life for this country. And I intend to set it right." Alicia's breath caught. She had grown used to disappointment, to empty promises, to lawyers who spoke of hope and then disappeared when things grew difficult. But something in Hale's tone was different, unyielding, resolute, the voice of a man used to giving orders that changed lives. "General," she whispered, "my father is scheduled to be transferred to maximum security tomorrow morning. They claim he's been organizing other inmates. If you're going to help him, it has to be now." There was no hesitation. "I'll be there before sunrise," Hale promised. Marcus Gray has waited 50 years for recognition. He won't wait another day. As Alicia hung up the phone, her hands trembled. For the first time since her father's arrest, she felt something that had been buried under fear and despair. Hope. Tomorrow would bring either vindication or the final crushing of an innocent man's spirit. But tonight, for the first time in months, she dared to believe that truth might actually matter more than lies. Dawn broke over Indianapolis with streaks of gold and crimson painting the skyline. At precisely 6:47 a.m., a helicopter descended onto the Marion County Courthouse parking lot. General Richard Hale emerged, his silver hair gleaming in the morning light, his uniform immaculate, ribbons glinting against his chest. At 71 years old, he carried himself with the same steel posture that had once led men into battle. In his hand was a leather briefcase. Inside it, documents that had been sealed in the Pentagon's archives for nearly half a century. Documents that revealed one of the most shameful cover-ups in American military history. Camera crews swarmed the scene, alerted by Alicia, their lenses capturing every step as Hale strode up the courthouse stairs. Behind him walked Colonel Elaine Parker, a Pentagon spokesperson, and Dr. Michael Tran, a historian who had spent years piecing together the fragments of a forgotten story. The air buzzed with anticipation, reporters shouting questions, microphones thrust forward, but Hale ignored them. He walked with the bearing of a man on a mission of honor. Inside, emergency hearings were being convened at breakneck speed. Judge Harold Benton, a man who had long thrived under political pressure, now found himself forced into an emergency evidentiary hearing. The whispers in the corridors grew louder by the minute. New evidence had emerged in the case of Marcus Gray, the decorated veteran turned convicted felon, a man whose name had become synonymous with disgrace. When Hale entered the courtroom, the atmosphere shifted. Conversations hushed. Cameras clicked. He took the stand, his voice steady, deliberate, carrying the authority of a soldier who had lived through hell and returned to tell the tale. "I am here to present evidence," he began, "that will not only clear Marcus Gray of the false charges brought against him, but prove that he is one of the greatest heroes our nation has ever known." His death left the paperwork adrift, and somewhere in the labyrinth of Pentagon offices, the recommendation was quietly buried. The courtroom gasped as Colonel Elaine Parker took the stand, unfolding memos that had been stamped top secret for half a century. Her voice was calm, but the words cut like knives. When Corporal Gray's Medal of Honor recommendation reached Washington, it was rejected, not because his actions failed to qualify, but because of institutional racism within the military hierarchy. She paused, her hands trembling slightly as she read from a redacted memo written in 1973. It states, quote, "Negro soldiers should not be awarded the nation's highest honor. Such recognition sends the wrong message about military leadership and risks unrest among colored troops." End quote. The silence that followed was deafening. Every journalist in the room scrambled to capture the words, cameras flashing as the weight of the revelation sank in. Marcus Gray, the man who had saved dozens of lives, had been deliberately erased from history because he was black. Dr. Michael Tran, the military historian who had helped Hale uncover the truth, leaned forward as he addressed the court. This was not an accident. It was a calculated decision to suppress recognition of a hero because of his race. And when Marcus Gray returned home, instead of honor, he was handed silence. Instead of medals, he was handed invisibility. His story should have been taught in every classroom. Instead, it was locked away in filing cabinets. As the truth unfolded, the case against Marcus began to collapse under its own weight. Reporters rushed to push updates to their networks. Across the country, news anchors broke into live coverage. Social media exploded. Hashtag Justice for Marcus Gray climbing to the top of trending lists within hours. Veterans groups issued statements of outrage, demanding his immediate release. Politicians scrambled to distance themselves from the growing scandal. The tide was turning, but the most devastating blow was yet to come. Later that afternoon, General Hale presented the final piece of evidence, a confession recorded on video just days earlier. The courtroom projector flickered to life, and the faces of three young men appeared. Ethan Clark, Ryan Miller, and Jason Ward. They were the very teenagers whose testimony had condemned Marcus Gray 18 months earlier. On the screen, Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His voice cracked with nervousness. "We made it up. Mr. Gray never threatened us. He just asked us to keep it down. We were drunk, we were angry, and we thought no one would ever believe him over us. We figured," he hesitated, his eyes lowering in shame. "We figured an old black man against three white college kids. The system would take our side. And it did." Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Alicia clutched her chest as tears streamed down her face. Ryan followed, his words blunt, his guilt undeniable. "We coordinated everything. We lied under oath. We practiced our stories. My dad even hired a lawyer to coach us. We knew if we stuck together, nothing would happen to us. And we were right. Until now." Jason, the last of the trio, stared directly into the camera. "What we did was wrong. We ruined a man's life because of our own arrogance and privilege. I'll never forgive myself." The screen went black. The silence that followed was heavier than before, crushing in its intensity. Judge Harold Bennon's face was pale, his hands trembling as he shuffled the papers in front of him. Around the courtroom, the crowd shifted uneasily, some weeping, others burning with rage. District Attorney Linda Monroe rushed to hold a press conference, trying desperately to contain the fallout. "If new evidence has emerged that calls into question Mr. Gray's conviction, my office will of course review it thoroughly," she declared, her voice brittle with panic. But no one believed her. Reporters grilled her with questions about how she could have pursued such a flimsy case. By evening, her political career was in ruins. Outside the courthouse, a storm was brewing. Veterans rode in motorcycle convoys, their jackets patched with slogans that read "Honor our heroes." Citizens gathered in protest, holding signs demanding Marcus's release. News outlets across the nation replayed the teenager's confessions on loop. The country had seen enough. Inside the prison walls, Marcus himself sat quietly in the common room, watching the reports unfold on a dusty television. For months, he had endured humiliation, isolation, and despair. But as he saw Ethan, Ryan, and Jason admit the truth, a faint smile touched his lips. For the first time in nearly 2 years, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the truth was stronger than the lies that had destroyed him. The walls of injustice were beginning to crack. The question was no longer whether Marcus Gray was innocent. The question now was whether America was ready to face the truth it had buried for half a century. The courtroom on the following morning was standing room only. Word of the teenager's confession had spread like wildfire, and now cameras lined the aisles, capturing every breath, every tremor of the proceedings. The air buzzed with tension, the kind that only comes when the world knows history is about to pivot. Marcus was led into the chamber, his wrists still shackled, but his posture straighter than it had been in months. For the first time, he did not lower his gaze. The people in the gallery, strangers, veterans, activists, even politicians, rose to their feet, applauding as though welcoming home a war hero. The bailiff barked for order, but the applause rolled on like a storm. Judge Benton's gavel struck hard against the wood, but even his voice trembled. This court has reviewed the confessions, the declassified documents, and the prosecutorial misconduct revealed in these proceedings. In light of the overwhelming evidence, it is the judgment of this court that Marcus Gray's conviction is vacated and the charges dismissed. The words seemed to hang in the air, almost unreal. Marcus blinked, his lips parting in disbelief. He had imagined this moment in his cell, dreamed of it in sleepless nights, but to hear it aloud, to feel it echo through the courtroom, it was almost too much. The guard stepped forward and unlocked the shackles around his wrists. The iron fell away with a dull clink, leaving behind wrists marked with scars of restraint. Marcus lifted his hands slowly, as if to test whether they were truly free. Then, for the first time in years, he stood not as an inmate, but as a free man. The gallery erupted. Veterans in leather jackets saluted him. Journalists pushed forward to capture the moment. Strangers wept openly, their voices breaking as they shouted his name. Alicia ran to him, wrapping her arms around her father in a fierce embrace. For a long moment, Marcus held her, burying his face in her hair, whispering words only she could hear. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but her smile was radiant, a smile that carried both relief and pride. Outside the courthouse, the scene was nothing short of a movement. Thousands had gathered, their chants echoing down the city streets. Justice for Marcus! Justice for Marcus! News helicopters hovered above, capturing the sea of signs, flags, and raised fists. Veterans on motorcycles revved their engines, forming a protective circle around the courthouse steps as Marcus walked out into the sunlight. It was the first sunlight he had felt as a free man in nearly 2 years. He paused at the top of the courthouse steps, Alicia at his side, General Hale and Colonel Parker behind him. The crowd hushed as he raised his hand in acknowledgement, his voice steady but resonant. "I am no hero," he began, his words carried by the wind. "I am just a man who tried to serve his country with honor. But the truth was stolen from me. And when truth is buried, justice is buried with it. Today is not just about me. It is about every man and woman who has been silenced, erased, or broken by lies. If my story can teach anything, let it teach this, that no matter how deep you bury the truth, it will rise again." The crowd erupted in cheers, a roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the courthouse. Marcus lowered his gaze, humbled by the sight of so many who believed in him, so many who had fought for him when he had nothing left. Back inside, District Attorney Monroe faced the press, her career disintegrating in real time. Questions rained down like bullets. Did you knowingly suppress evidence? Were you aware of the racial bias in Gray's case? Will you resign? Her answers faltered, her face pale, her voice stripped of authority. By evening, calls for her resignation filled the headlines. The machine that had once crushed Marcus was now devouring itself. As Marcus walked through the streets later that night, escorted by veterans and embraced by strangers, his eyes lifted to the sky. The city lights glowed above, but beyond them, he thought of the jungle nights in Vietnam, the stars that had guided him when everything seemed lost. He thought of his fallen brothers in arms, of Major Reeves, who had written his Medal of Honor recommendation before fate silenced him. Marcus whispered into the night, as if speaking to their memory, "We made it out, brothers. We finally made it out." That night, for the first time in years, Marcus Gray slept not behind bars, but in his daughter's home. Not as a forgotten soldier, not as an inmate, but as a free man. The weeks that followed Marcus Gray's release felt like something between a victory march and a national reckoning. Across television screens, newspapers, and radio broadcasts, his story dominated every headline. Commentators debated not only the misconduct that nearly destroyed him, but the deeper sickness it revealed, how bias and prejudice could twist justice until it became unrecognizable. For every celebration of his freedom, there was also a haunting question: how many more Marcus Grays are still buried in silence? Congress convened emergency hearings. Military officials were summoned under oath, forced to explain how a decorated veteran had been discarded so carelessly, how evidence had been buried while falsehoods were paraded as truth. Generals and senators sparred under the bright lights of national television, the weight of their words measured not just by political cost, but by the watching eyes of millions. The faces of the teenagers who had falsely accused Marcus appeared on screens as well, shaken, regretful, their words of confession replayed endlessly. For the first time, the country was forced to confront the corrosive power of prejudice, laid bare in front of the world. Meanwhile, Marcus himself avoided the spotlight as best he could. Reporters camped outside Alicia's home, hoping for an exclusive, but Marcus spent most of his days quietly adjusting to freedom. Simple things became monumental: drinking coffee at a cafe without shackles, walking through a park with his daughter, sitting on a porch at dusk, and hearing the world without prison gates clanging shut. For him, freedom was not noise or attention. It was silence, peace, and breath. But history wasn't finished with Marcus. One morning, a sealed letter arrived by courier. Alicia brought it to him, her hands trembling as he opened it. The crest of the United States Army glistened on the page. It was official. The Department of Defense had reinstated Marcus's eligibility for the Medal of Honor. A formal review board, having examined the testimonies and declassified reports, unanimously agreed that his actions in Vietnam merited the nation's highest military distinction.